is Steve Davis. Today's going to be a photography 101 class from the beginning. I'm going to introduce some basics, I'm going to show you some cameras, I'm going to show you how to, and it's about lighting. With light, you get colors, you get contrast, you get clarity, acuity, detail. Without light, there are no colors. Think about nighttime. As the sun goes down, you can't see as clearly. As the sun goes down, you lose those bright reds and yellows. Most of your darker images are going to be on the bluer end. So lighting is everything. So with that, let's have some light. When we talk about light, we're going to talk about the eye. The eye and the camera are very similar. Your eye will take the light that is transmitted or reflected. So we have reflection, like when light strikes a mirror and then the light comes to you, that light enters the eye through the cornea, through your lens, and focuses. The camera, very similar. This is a digital camera, and it has the ability to zoom in and out. It has glass. Glass is everything. The quality of the glass gives you the quality of your image. As the glass lines up, you bring it into focus. As your cornea and your lens lines up through the musculature in the eye, it brings your picture into focus. As that light then goes through the eye, it strikes the retina, the back of the eye, which is the sensor of the eye, which turns an electromagnetic wave, light, into a digital image. The impulse then goes to the brain. Your brain interprets it. The camera has a sensor in the back also. A CMOS sensor, a 1-inch sensor, different types of sensors. That gives you the quality and the detail of the image that you can capture. The light goes through the camera. The light goes through my eye. I have a pupil surrounded by an iris, and I'll interject some photos with this. The pupil says dilates and constricts, allowing more or less light in, controlled by the iris or the aperture of your camera. The aperture allows more or less light in. It also controls the depth of field, the amount of the field that is in focus or out of focus. Depending on what do I want to take a picture of. Portrait, landscape. Do I want everything in focus, or do I want to take a portrait where I'm in focus but the background is blurred? Here are some examples. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about the eye. The eye has a lid. The lid goes and allows a certain amount of light. If I close my eyes, there's no light getting in. Well, the camera has a shutter. As with the aperture, the shutter can allow more or less light in. The longer the shutter is open, the more light gets in. So this light, as it enters into the eye, well, I got the aperture that allows more or less light. I got a shutter that allows more or less light. It's a combination of how I do the settings in the camera to get the image that I want. If I open the shutter, if I keep my eye wide open and I dilate my pupil and I open up the aperture, when you open the aperture, so let's talk about the aperture. We'll call it the f-stop. We'll have numbers on it, like this lens allows me to go, depending on my zoom, let's say 2.8, and I might be able to go up to 24. Depends on the lens This type of camera, I can put different lenses on for different effects. So the aperture, the smaller the number, the larger the opening. But when we talk about taking a portrait and a closer picture, when I open the aperture, my depth of field decreases. So if I want to take a portrait, my camera, and many drones, has the ability to set a priority. Do I want to shoot fully automatic, in which the camera just says the light that comes in, I want it to be even. What do I mean about this? Well, there's a range, a tonal range. If I get too much light, I get overexposure. My highlights get blown out. It's a washed out picture. I lose detail. My contrast is disappearing. On the other end of the spectrum, too dark. So we don't want to be too dark and we don't want to be too light. So by a combination of aperture, shutter, and there's another magic something that used to be with film speed called ISO, but I'm not going to get into ISO. Let's keep this to aperture, shutter, auto. Auto is going to set anything at once so that the picture looks good, but it doesn't give you the special effect that a good photographer, a creative photographer. So I have to envision, do I want my focus of the subject centered? Do I want them on the lower thirds? Do I want to show this area? Or do I want, so they'll break the scene into thirds and they'll say lower, middle, upper thirds. So you have to envision, how do you want this picture? Take 50 pictures, hope for one good one. Try different settings, hope for one good one. Back to the aperture. If I set my aperture to a lower number, I let more light in. Conversely, my shutter speed has to be adjusted so that I don't let too much light in. If I want to take a portrait and I want to blur the background out, I use a lower aperture number. The lower the number, my depth of field gets smaller, decreases, and the more the background's blurred. The larger the number, especially if I'm further away and I use a larger number, everything's in focus. For a portrait, smaller number, depth of field, I might be sitting in the grass and I have a smaller number. The grass in front gets blurrier, the background gets blurrier, but I'm in focus. That's aperture priority. To have the picture totally in focus, I have to have a large f-stop number. The smaller the f-stop number, the more blurry the background becomes. Notice the shutter will compensate to allow an even amount of light into the picture. Shutter priority. Shutter allows, there's a mirror, my eyelid, allows the light to come in for a certain amount of time. Light is very, very quick. The light will overexpose rather quickly. But the more light that comes in, the image might be standing still, or I might have a prop that's spinning at 2700 RPMs, revolutions per minute, very fast, and it's going to be blurred if I leave the lens open too long, the shutter too long. I have to say, do I want a sharp, crisp picture, or do I want a blurry picture? That's going to be your shutter speed. So you have to think about shutter speed. If I have an action shot and somebody is moving, if my shutter is too open too long, too slow, such as it gives it seconds, 1/30th of a second If I'm moving, will be blurred. Here the camera is tracking the subject, the dog, with a slower shutter, gives the blurred background. Even more pronounced, I follow a fast-moving plane with a slow shutter, gives a blurred background. If I want to have that crisp, I'll have to be 1/500th of a second, so the shutter will be open much quicker. However, the faster the shutter is, the crisper the picture, the more in focus. But what about the aperture? Aperture times the shutter is the amount of light, such as I can have many combinations of apertures and shutters, like the number 24. I can have 24 divided by 1. I can have 24 divided by 2. So I can have 12 times 2. I can have 6 times 4. I can have 3 times 8, 12 times 2, 24 times 1. All of these combinations are the same thing that I can do with most cameras, fully controllable. So the bottom line is I still want 24 amounts of light to come in. So if my aperture is fixed, I have to adjust the shutter so that I get that certain amount of light, so that my tonal range gives me the right amount of highlights, the right amount of blacks, shadows, so that it's not overexposed or underexposed. So you have to take numerous pictures. So if I'm shooting at aperture 2.8, I might try a shutter of 1/500. Too dark. I'll have to go the shutter slower, so I'll go 1/250. Try that. Another way you can trick it out is there's a program setting that if you just hold this button down partially, it will tell you what the proper setting is, and then you adjust it for certain differences in the picture. So let's go back to shutter. The shutter is going to stay open as long as you want it, and you can set it, and there's a dial on the top, and you roll it around, and as you make the shutter slower, 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 if it's shutter priority, you have to adjust the aperture, because what you want is the shutter. Like I took a picture of a prop of an airplane. I used many different shutter speeds, and I allowed the aperture to change. Here are some examples. You'll see them. Okay, I'm back. Now, not all cameras allow you to do this, but most of your drones will. Some of the older cameras have certain other functions. They're point and shoot. Put it on, boom, shoot, done. Some others are for underwater, and they're going to have less capability. The more expensive the camera is, the more capabilities you'll have. You also have some very sophisticated phones that have cameras in them, and the phones have exactly what these cameras have, but not as good. Let's talk about flash photography. Flash photography is where I don't have enough light. So if I put this on and the flash, pop, it's only there for a very, very short amount of time. Light is very fast. So if I use flash photography, I'm going to have to set my shutter speed to capture that light. 1/60th of a second, maybe 1/125th of a second. But if I shoot 1/500th of a second, only 1/60 or 1/125th of a second, am I going to capture that? The rest of that's going to be dark. So when I use flash photography, my shutter setting has to be slower. I'll adjust the aperture to compensate. The other thing with flash photography is I can point the flash and have the light straight on. I can have it bounce off of a surface. I can have it diffused. I can have it reflect it. So there's a lot of different ways of using flash photography. To sum it up, your camera is a tool for you to creatively make a scene that is your artwork, that is your vision. You will then figure out, what do I want to see? Do I want to see action, portrait, landscape, and then your aperture and your